Databases, and I should say the use of these large databases is a step forward. Previous definitions for sepsis and septic shock had really just been done by consensus conference without data. It's nice to have some data here. But QuickSOFA was designed, really put together in a retrospective way using those large databases. So there are big gaps in the databases, and the utility of QuickSOFA is for patients outside the ICU, not in patients that are already in a critical care unit, and presumptively identifies groups of patients at higher risk of death during their hospitalization or higher risk of poor outcome.
Have the new definitions generated any discussion, any hallway discussions with your colleagues?
Well, I think in every healthcare system, sepsis is important. The patients with sepsis consume a lot of resources. They're very expensive, very common diagnosis in the intensive care unit, very common cause of death or associated with a poor outcome. So having new definitions is certainly useful. I know in our surgery services, our critical care services, internal medicine services, certainly has been conversation. These articles have really been noticed.
You know, as I was reading your editorial, and it was putting those 3 papers into very good perspective, toward the end of the editorial, you say that the sepsis, the way that clinicians think about sepsis, is the way that maybe a couple of generations ago they used to think about cancer. And that
an meningococcal infection could be an elderly patient in his or her 80s, has a lot of underlying disorders, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, maybe Alzheimer's, now gets a urinary tract infection because of their indwelling Foley catheter, and now develops organ dysfunction. Yet the definition will say both of them have sepsis. Now clearly their prognosis, their outcome, very likely their underlying cellular abnormalities are very, very different, and it's just not part of the new definitions. So it really leaves us in a situation like cancer was a number of years ago, where not only have we not differentiated between, for example, lung cancer and prostate cancer here, from non-small cell lung cancer and other kinds of lung cancer, but we haven't talked about underlying abnormalities. And the great leap forward in cancer and treatment for cancer has been identification of specific cell types involved, specific receptors that predict response to therapy, specific cellular abnormalities that also predict response to therapy. And we're not there with sepsis, and not there with the new definitions either. So I see a really large gap that will need to be covered in the future if we want to develop new therapeutic options for this very important disorder.
There were 15 years between the last revision of these definitions and the current ones. Do you think that the pace of research now, that there will be another 15 years before they're revised again?
I hope it'll be a shorter period of time. There's been tremendous and the nature, the etiology of organ dysfunctions, not included in these new categories. One would hope relatively shortly that we'll move. Some concern that I and others have about the definition for septic shock, which includes a lactate measurement. Lactate is supposed to be above 2, and in developing countries limited or even moderate resources, they may not be able to measure lactate. So there's some concern about how generalizable these definitions would be on an international basis. Be that as it may, having more clear-cut definitions should raise awareness of sepsis. It's a very important condition. QuickSOFA should help identify patients who are not in the ICU, but are at risk for
found that the authors were interested in defining. So the sensitivity of infection plus SIRS, which is what they tested, versus the new infection plus SOFA criteria is more or less the same. Our real concern is not that the sensitivity, sensitivity is another way of saying true positive rate. In other words, if this test is present, if these criteria are present, it is an indicator that mortality is going to happen. Okay, so the true positive rate of both tests is about the same. However, we believe, most of us who work in sepsis believe that the infection plus SIRS in most cases of sepsis precedes the onset of the organ dysfunction that one finds with what we used to call severe sepsis and what the JAMA article now calls sepsis.
As I was reading the new definitions and the editorial surrounding it, and looking through the papers that were supporting the definition, I got the sense that these, and that the editorialists for JAMA also saw these basically as epidemiological tools, so that in the course of defining, in a large population, how many of these people had sepsis, then you could do that more accurately, because of they compared the area under the operator receiving curve for the various approaches. And you mentioned SIRS, which for people, I can't imagine if clinicians won't know what SIRS is, but I will tell them, which that is systemic inflammatory response syndrome. In the definitional paper, they say that SIRS, and maybe the editorial as well, they say that SIRS is often present without sepsis, but you're arguing, and I hear you, that you don't want to wait until you get a deflection in the SOFA score of 2, because that means that the patient is very well be on their way out. So, do you fear that the rush to adopt these inappropriately would translate to clinical use, which would mean don't look so much for SIRS, but look for these changes in SOFA score, which you point out in your editorial are not in wide
quite frequently associated with mortality. So it is an important entity. So I think the point that I make is that some infections are very minor. For example, cuts and scrapes clearly represent a very minor type of infection that cause no systemic symptoms whatsoever. Some infections are more severe and cause such things as tachycardia, tachypnea, high white count, and fever. And that's a system-wide manifestation of the severity of the infection. And then the most severe infections, of course, cause organs to dysfunction. And I think we have no particular problem with the definition of sepsis as life-threatening organ dysfunction, as the authors have stated. My real problem is this, that it's clear that infection plus SIRS is a severe infection. I believe this, that the language that we use to describe a particular condition conditions the way that we think about that condition. And the way we think about it determines how we act upon it. So what we have done is removed the combination infection plus SIRS from the sepsis lexicon, if you will. So it is now just infection. When it becomes just infection, the sense of urgency, I am certain, will dissipate over time. There will no longer be a reason, unless we push for a reason, there will no longer be a reason for people to believe I need my antibiotics rapidly, and perhaps I need fluids rapidly.
You said that the SOFA scores are not in wide use except within academic centers. Do you think that a better, you said that you burned about 30,000 miles in your car's engine trying to get people to appreciate earlier when the sepsis exists. Do you think that the SOFA score, or there are two questions here. The SOFA score, is that useful, or is the QSOFA or quick SOFA score, which is tachypnea, as you said, and a decreased systolic pressure. Do do you think that either of those two, if introduced to routine clinical practice outside of academic centers, would be useful?
Yeah, I actually think that these scores are both useful. What the authors are saying with the quick sofa is they understand that the sofa per se is rather unwieldy. It's a 5x4 box of different criteria you have to remember for different severities of illness for different organs, and that's not going to be easy. So to their credit, they did look for something simpler to use and find the Q sofa. And frankly, a decade into a change that we know is historically, this is going to take another 8 to 10 years.
Right, so you get another 30,000 miles to put on your car at least.
Yeah.
I'm shocked to hear that it's that long. I had thought of it in terms of something like 7 or 8 years before guidelines are widely adopted, and maybe that will change now because there are measures of performance measures that clinicians are being held to account on. But
well, it's entirely possible. Yes.
What do you wish to be the best outcome for this redefinition? What would you like to see happen?
Right. What I would like to see happen is the reincorporation of the notion that SIRS indicates a serious infection into the broader umbrella of sepsis. I think that we have purposefully removed it because of the perceived lack of specificity. And if you don't mind, I want to take a minute to talk about that perceived lack and whether you use this or not is...
No, sure, go ahead.
The argument that's proposed fairly commonly is, look, if I climb a set of stairs, I get SIRS. I breathe fast and I get tachycardia. If I watch a horror movie, I may get SIRS. Okay? If I have a surgery, everyone post-surgery has SIRS. And therefore, this makes SIRS a worthless thing to look for in any instance, which I think is a rather simplistic view, I have to say. In point of fact, I look at it entirely the other way. SIRS is a natural response to physiologic stress. Your heart beats fast, you breathe fast, you may get a fever, your white count goes up. This is a response to physiologic stress. Climbing a set of stairs is a physiologic stress. Pretty minor one. It goes away when you stop climbing the stairs. If you are lying on a bed or a gurney, and the physiologic stress that you have is an infection, and I can look at you and see that that is a physiologic stress, it is incumbent upon us to try and take away that physiologic stress as soon as possible. Because SIRS is telling me that you are stressed and you are not in a good position physiologically. So what gives this specificity to SIRS is when you can look at a patient and say, this guy has no reason for SIRS except that he's infected. Aha, this has meaning. As a matter of fact, we know that the mortality associated with that combination is somewhere between 5 and 16%, depending on the study that you look at. So I just don't take such a simplistic view of because other things can cause SIRS, SIRS is not useful. I would point out pneumonia. If I have a patient with that kind of syndrome and they have SIRS, this has some meaning. As opposed to every little time someone gets a fever, oh my gosh, I have to suspect the direst infection. I think what I'm saying is that there is a level of sophistication of thought that all doctors are capable of if they would indulge themselves.
If they have time to do so. All right, Dr. Simpson. Well, this is enlightening, and I want to thank you. The authors of the definitions were encouraging this kind of discussion at the end. So you've certainly taken them up on that score with your dissent, and I want to thank you for spending time with us today.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. And by the way, I want to say that I respect and admire every single one of the authors of those papers. And in fact, some of them are friends of mine. So there is no animosity. We just have a different way of looking at things.
All right, fair enough.
All right.
You've been listening to the 197th Clinical Conversation. The others are all available at podcasts.jwatch.org. I do appreciate your suggestions, and would you please send any to me at JELIA@NEJM less. Dr. Bindu Kalisan is in the Department of Medicine at Boston University. Let me see whether I can summarize your approach. You examined a range of gun laws in effect in the 50 states, determined which were associated with the lowest firearm-related mortality, and then estimated how adopting the best laws nationally would affect death rates.
What we found was, our main exposure of interest was 25 different gun laws across 50 states in the U.S., specifically in the year 2009. We primarily found that out of the 25 gun laws, 9 were effective. And the 9 laws were requiring state license for sales, requiring dealers to keep and retain sales records, requiring dealership to have at least one store security version, firearm identification by ballistic fingerprint or microfiche, requiring gun owners to report lost or stolen guns, require universal background checks for purchase of all firearms, requiring universal background checks for purchase of ammunition, while the 3 laws of universal background checks for purchase, ammunition, for firearm purchase, for ammunition purchase, and requiring firearm identification was also found to be associated with reduction in assault or homicide guns. Therefore, our findings underscore the importance of relevant and effective guns, and particularly the potential impact of national level implementation of background checks to reduce guns.
Okay. Now, these comparisons were associative, weren't they? In other words, if I can explain myself, you looked at the states where these gun laws were in effect, and then created a measure of their firearm-related mortality. And
that is correct.
Okay.
Yes. We used the gun laws from 2009, and then we used the gun death rates in 2010.
Okay.
And then we used the their social covariables.
Gunned down
we adjusted
all the time. They're always getting gunned
to find
down.
the independent effect of each of these gun laws.
And
then using that model, we predicted national level implementation. If we implement these 3 most effective laws, if these 3 effective laws were separately and together, if they were implemented nationwide, that means at the federal level, then what will be the reduction in the gun death?
And when you say that you put you calculated them separately and together, the abstract of your paper seems to give the message that, for instance, background checks for ammunition would reduce it down to 1 point, roughly 2 per 100,000 from the current 10. But if I understand what you're saying here, that is in addition to the other 2 laws.
Actually, that is separate.
Really?
So, if you see, yes. So, imagine this. This country has enough, as many guns in this country as there are residents. Right? So, if we have background checks for ammunition purchase, then it will be a lot more effective than only for firearm purchase. So, according to us, it makes perfect sense. So, what we see is a reduction of 57% when background checks are used for firearm purchase alone, but it falls down to about 1.9, around 2 per 100,000 when it is ammunition for ammunition purchase.
So if you could only choose one law to implement nationally, it might be the ammunition purchase.
I would think so.
Yeah. Okay. Now,
because it is very hard to buy back someone. I know other countries have had effective smoking, and then it was a long road, right? In order to pass some legislation, in order to pass that law, and we have succeeded in reducing smoking rates, and also the risk associated with due to smoking. So we have done that already. So there is already a precedent set in this regard. And also looking at motor vehicle accidents. So we've had, you can still do your thing, you can still keep your car, but at the same time with the right laws, we are still able to reduce the harmful effects. We do not want injuries, and we do not want death, because I'm an optimist with this, because we do have some things that we have achieved as a country because of the social will and compromises that people have done, and also backed with proper scientific evidence.
so the editorialist expresses some skepticism, saying that the result that you postulate, over a 90% reduction, is too large. Could you refute that?
Well, this is what we said. So earlier on, I have to give you some background on this. So the information what we were working on was a cumulative score of, some sort of cumulative score which the Brady Center came up with, rates all the states according to their restrictive gun laws and permissive gun laws, and had a legislative strength score. So Dr. Hemingway's group, headed by, I think, Dr. Flieger, had put out this manuscript where they looked at the score and the same thing, looking at across different states, and found that the states which have restrictive gun laws are more effective in reducing gun death rates. So they found out that. So what we did in our study was just to expand the findings what Dr. Hemingway has put out. Okay? He described that. And what we did was we wanted to find out, okay, we found that the restrictive, when you have restrictive gun laws, it does reduce gun death rates. Now, let us find out something even more solid, something a little bit more concrete, where it can be put into proper, effective policy, where it can be implemented federally, and then it can be across the entire country. So that is the reason why we took these 25 gun laws in one of those same years. He used from 2007, I think, until 2010, and we used 2009 to do that. And we used almost exactly the same laws to do that. But the only difference was we wanted to find out which of these were most effective, rather than having 99 different laws and everybody implements, passes different versions of these laws and implements it in different ways.
Against real world data perspective.
Well, that's the thing. Once we do once we create a statistical model, and from the model, that technically it's called a prediction.
Okay.
Okay, what we did is model, the mathematical model.
Right.
And this is technically the word we use is prediction.
Okay, that's
so using that model.
Okay, that's fair. I just wanted to be clear as a non-statistician that's what you were doing, and I would have used the word estimate prospectively. It would be interesting now to see if those laws go into effect in the given states, and you have data on all of them.
But remember, when you still talk in terms of just states implementing these laws, each of these states implement these laws separately, and then there's something called as reciprocity between these states, which means that you can buy a gun if you live in a state with very restrictive gun laws, and you can buy a gun from a different state, and it can cross borders, and if there's a reciprocity law in between, you can even if you are a criminal or whatever, you will not pass a background check in your own state. You can buy it across the state lines and bring it into the state.
Yes.
So that is the reason why we say it is important to have a federal level implementation of these laws.
One final question, Dr. Kellison. What should clinicians do with these results? And I'm asking that question because, of course, you can't bring them into the clinic with you, but you can use them, I guess, in the position of advocacy. Is that right? Is that
absolutely? Okay. That is correct. So for the physicians, this is what I would think is important. First of all, there are already eight different states which allow campus carry. And in Florida, they do not allow physicians to talk about gun ownership to their own patients. So physicians are an integral part of this conversation that we're having. And what we need, as I said earlier, it's not a unidimensional problem. What we have is a multifaceted problem where we need involvement of people who are in the gun culture, who lives the gun culture, who understands it, and who wants to keep it going. And then there are people who are providers, healthcare providers, who care for the gun violence survivors, and then the community and the policymakers and the researchers together. So I think it is important to keep that in mind, that gun violence does not just kill, it also maims, and it brings about injuries and then disability, followed by multiple hospitalizations, reduced quality of life. So for every one person who's shot...
Dr. Kellison, I want to thank you so much for spending time with us today.
Thank you.
That was the 198th of our series. All the others are available at podcasts.jwatch.org. My executive producer is Kristen Kelly, and we come to you through the NEJM Group. Thank you for listening. Clinical Conversations, I'm Joe Elia. Harlan Krumholtz, the editor of Circulation, Cardiovascular Quality and Outcomes, editorialized on the future of journals a few months back. He titled it, The End of Journals. Dr. Krumholtz, in addition to that editorship, is the Hines Professor of Medicine at Yale, where he has duties as a cardiologist and in the Center for Outcomes Research and Evaluation and in the Robert Wood Johnson Clinical Scholars Program. Full disclosure, he's also editor